Here we go. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. We're really excited to participate in this conference. We think it's obviously very timely and just important information for us to be sharing across the country. Today, I've assembled a panel of co-worker and collaborators from across the country. My name is Michael Wilkins. I'm the Director of Sustainability for TVG Partners. We're located in Texas, based out of Austin, but we have offices in all the large cities here in Texas. My coworker, Haley Powell, who's going to be presenting with us, is also with TVG. She is in our Dallas office along with me. And we also have Scott Snodgrass from the Edible Group, also in Texas, and Jeffrey Landau from Agritecture Consulting out of New York City. Our presentation is going to be focused on urban agriculture food security as it relates specifically to climate action plans, particularly in the Texas area where we're doing a lot of our work, and how we can utilize these actions set by climate action plans to really start pushing us forward in food security, resilience, and really getting our urban agriculture practices better aligned within our cities. And just to give a little overview of what's going on in Texas, looking at 4 of the major cities here, all of these cities have adopted climate and resiliency plans, and each one of these plans have specific goals that are related to food security. We'll go through a few of those. I'm actually in Houston today. You may be able to see a little bit of Houston in the background through my windows here. But Houston adopted Resilient Houston in March of 2020. They've recently this year published their 1-year report. But I wanted to highlight some food security, food resilience specific items that were conveyed in their plan. And they've set goals to grow equitable access to quality food. They've set pretty aggressive goals to invest in the local food ecosystem. And set goals to increase urban farming, community gardens, and food forests. Obviously, these goals set by these plans begin to spur new initiatives like urban agriculture plans, et cetera. In our hometown in Dallas, we adopted the Dallas Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan in May of 2020. There are some very specific strategies set aside that are related to, again, food security and urban agriculture. And we've set goals to build more of an organizational capacity and partnerships. Jeffrey's going to talk about some of the work that we're doing for the city of Dallas in preparation of their first urban agriculture, comprehensive urban agriculture plan for the city, which is very exciting. But climate related, we're also looking at things like how do we reduce food miles by incorporating and building more local food production and consumption. Food miles is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, obviously, and food plays a very large role in that, and how we get it to our stores and how we get it as consumers. We also want to improve food access within the neighborhood, so we're looking at food deserts and things like that. And one of the key strategies we're looking at is how do we increase urban gardens, and more specifically, better organized and collaborative urban gardens across the Metroplex. Austin was one of the first communities to adopt a climate plan way back in 2015, and they've set some very specific goals as well related to increasing local food production, et cetera. And now they're really starting to shift their focus on building that organizational capacity and building off the success of groups like the Festival Beach Food Forest and other initiatives throughout the city. So some exciting things happening in Austin as well. San Antonio, I'm an environmental engineer, and one of the things that strikes me with San Antonio is that they've really started to look at, okay, we know that we have to reduce impervious surfaces. We know that we could better utilize government-owned facilities, and how can we potentially do that in a greener way? And by greener, it doesn't just mean creating more tree canopy, but urban agriculture can play a key role in that in terms of reducing impervious surfaces, making more productive properties, and starting to address things like urban heat island and also, obviously, food security. And then the first Progressive Food Forward plan was actually adopted earlier this year as a nod to New York City and Jeffrey with all the initiatives there. They passed Food Forward New York City, which is the first 10-year food policy plan in the United States, and it's very much data-driven analysis. And Jeffrey, I know that you'll probably point out some of the unique characteristics of that plan and those initiatives. So again, welcome. We appreciate you being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Haley.
Hi, everyone. I just want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be moving through these slides pretty quickly just to make sure that we save some time for Q&A at the end. Just to kick us off, I would love it if you guys would think back to COVID really quickly. Just think about when we were in the depths of lockdown, we had a lot of empty shelves. We saw issues with supply chain. We had issues with shipping delays and a lot of other issues crop up. And as the climate continues to change, we can anticipate more curveballs being thrown our way. And so one way to create a more resilient food system moving ahead is to link up with something like permaculture. And the whole idea behind permaculture is that you're going to be using natural processes and systems to work with nature rather than against it, so that ultimately you will have a lower maintenance food productive system that is more resilient to change over time than perhaps a conventional agricultural setup. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Specifically, today we're going to be talking about food forests. They mimic natural forests by taking the 7 basic layers of a natural forest. You can see them listed on the screen here. And you're going to be filling those niches with productive and beneficial plants. And ultimately, as these begin to grow in together, they will act like a natural forest over time, so it will need less maintenance than your typical agricultural farm. Next slide, please. So this is kind of still catching on in the US, but as you can see on the far right, there are food forests across the globe, and one of them in Morocco has been estimated to be about 2,000 years old, and it is still producing today. So naturally, we have some catching up to do, and you can see them cropping up across the US, and one of them is actually in Austin, one Michael mentioned, Festival Beach Food Forest. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Next slide, please. One of the reasons you can see these popping up so quickly are the plethora of co-benefits that food forests offer. In addition to alleviating food insecurity and increasing food resilience on the ground, they can also mitigate environmental issues such as the urban heat island effect, and even can help reduce some flooding. They can also benefit the local community and in turn increase safety and can even affect health over time. And it also benefits ecology, as the natural diversity of a food forest can become a home for local wildlife and pollinators. Next slide, please. This is just an example of some of the research I did for my graduate school project when I was citing a hypothetical food forest. All of these co-benefits make food forests a really awesome solution for neighborhoods that have been habitually overlooked and perhaps even disenfranchised. What I'm showing here is the site that I chose. It is well within a food forest or a food desert in Oklahoma City, and it actually suffered from severe flooding really regularly. And so with that in mind, I developed a site plan for an existing park. Next slide, please. This is just an example of what I developed. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the plan itself, but I would like you to know the pod-like structure of the circulation that I developed. That is going to come back up when I talk about how to phase in a food forest. First, I'm going to tell you though about succession and maybe how you would go about installing a food forest and following the natural succession from a grassland all the way to a forest. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you're going to start off with your pioneer plants. These are typically plants that are really adapted to a lot of exposure, hot, dry, sunny conditions, and they can tolerate a ton of abuse and a lot of poor soil. Specifically, you're going to want to plant nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators. These will not only tolerate poor soil, but they will help improve your soil over time. So when you start off, you want about 95% of your plants to be these species so that it'll create a great foundation as you start to integrate more productive species over time. Then as your soil health improves, it can start supporting more species, more productive species, and this is a great time to start integrating your canopy trees, whether they be productive or nitrogen fixers, so that you can start to develop that overstory and begin the production of microclimates. And I'm going to cover that in the next slide. As these trees grow in, they're going to start to shade out some of your pioneer plants. You'll also add in some of your woody pioneers and shrubs that can help create those microclimates even further. And typically the way that that happens is these lower vegetative layers help to trap in moisture in the soil, and they will also create a temperature buffer. So species that would not typically love your climate can sometimes hang out in these shadier areas, and it'll help create greater biodiversity for your food forest over time. This is also a great point to start introducing your understory species so that they can begin to get established and the canopy will start to shield them from that really severe sun. At this point, you also want about 50% nitrogen fixers and productive species. There we go, next slide. Thank you. At this point, as you start to grow up, it's going to begin to actually look more like a forest. Your pioneer species are really going to be struggling at this point because they love all that sun, and the canopy is developing further and it's going to begin to shade them out. You're going to help them on their way out, and you're going to start marking some of the plants that you're going to want to remove. Some of these nitrogen fixing trees will begin to shade out your productive species. And as we move further down the line of succession, we really want to start favoring those productive species. So mark all the ones that are kind of problematic children, and we're going to move on to the next slide. And then eventually it will become, hopefully, a mature forest. You should have a fully developed understory, and you should start removing all of those nitrogen fixing canopy trees that might be hindering your food production. 95% should be productive, and you still want to hang on to that 5% of nitrogen fixing trees just to keep the soil healthy. And as you do remove these, I would recommend trying to keep all of that organic material on site as mulch or as compost, just so that it can further feed into that soil health and continue that cycle. And one thing I will note on this, oh, can we go back? Thank you. These are not static states. So as it reaches a mature forest, if one species does become too dominant, some people will knock it back to either a young forest or even a shrubland and kind of redevelop it to become a more balanced ecosystem. So it will not necessarily stay a mature forest all the time. It will need some guidance on that. Now we can go into how we'd actually implement this rate of succession on site. Starting off, you really want to take care of your earthworks, all of your grading. Not only will this help you to distribute rainwater across your site, it will also help you to shape the experience of users on site with berms and swales to help reduce the need for irrigation. And it's really important that you concentrate on this at the beginning, because once your plants are established, it can be really difficult to go back and change them without disrupting your planting. Also consider your circulation early on. That will also shape the experience for the users, and it will help limit compaction down the line. Once those are in, you're just going to coat the site in pioneers, absolutely carpet bomb it. Focus your tallest species to the north and east, and that will help create a sun trap and allow more equitable light access. Next slide, please. And then you'll start moving through that rate of succession, adding in your perennials, canopy trees, understory, etc. And something else to note, keep in mind that as your canopy and your understory grow in, your pioneers are going to start to struggle. So you're going to need a plant palette that has a diversity of light conditions. The same plants will not work throughout this entire process. So you need to come into this knowing that as your canopy trees grow in, you're going to need some understory trees that will be able to handle some of that shade. Next slide, please. And then finally, as you move into the forest, you can start plugging in some of those holes with your herbaceous layer, your ground cover, etc. Your annuals and your vines are kind of wild cards. Annuals can actually do really well in the earlier phases where they get a ton of light. And towards the end, they're going to be a little bit more on the perimeter of the food forest where they can get the light that they need. And vines can go in pretty much as soon as there's something there to support them. And finally, just to wrap this up, I'm going to show you, using the site plan that I showed you a little bit earlier with this pod structure, how you could potentially use those pods to create a phasing plan that's helpful for the community. Something that I've noticed with a lot of permaculture is it really relies on the community to buy in, and creating these pods allows the community to take chunks off as they seem to be able. So you could start off doing a rate of maybe 1 or 2 pods a year and maybe pick up if you get a lot of community support. And you can even scale it back if you find you've overcommitted a little bit. But having a really clear-cut pod system really helps you to be able to take off workable amounts and create a lot of momentum behind the plan. This is also just a hypothetical scenario. This is not prescriptive in any way, and it does show a pretty quick rate of succession. So if you ever do take on a food forest, don't be shocked if it takes a little bit longer to get something like this going. Now, I've kind of covered the gamut of food forests. I'm going to pass it off to Scott, and he's going to talk a little bit more about other urban ag approaches.
Thanks, Haley. Scott, I'm going to pass it to you here in a second. I just wanted to highlight that this is a really good indication of why it's so important that there is an organized effort to expand things like food forests and even urban agriculture when we're trying to address not just food security and local food production, but also environmental restoration, flood mitigation. These are large-scale projects, and they take a long time frame to get them fully established. So I think this is a really good way to see just how much commitment it's going to take, and I think it's really helpful to start setting realistic goals within your community as you start planning things like food forests and large-scale coordinated urban agriculture. Thanks, Haley. I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
Thanks. I'm Scott Snodgrass with the Edible Group, as Michael mentioned, and we're a small family of companies that work at the intersection of plants, people, and place. And our company Agmenity, which we're really speaking on behalf of today, essentially installs agricultural amenities for developers, cities, institutions, school districts, those sorts of organizations. So we have a 6-year history now of basically installing small vegetable farms that are community oriented for developers and institutions. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the planning that it takes to install these. And this can run across all of the different formats that Jeffrey's going to go through in a minute, all the spectrum of urban agriculture. It certainly applies, some of it will apply a little bit more to the land-based sections of that sector. But it's really important that as we're planning these agricultural amenities or these farms, these food producing systems, that there is an integrated planning process. And so I mean that in a few different ways. First, there has to be a lot of intentionality built in the beginning about what the purpose of these are going to be, because different types of food production systems can serve different purposes better than others. Versus afterthought, which is often what we see, where you might say, hey, we have this leftover chunk of land in our land plan, and we didn't have another use for it, so want to make it a farm. And all too often that can lead to a far less desirable outcome than planning it from the beginning. One important thing to consider as we're planning agricultural systems in urban environments is what's recently been termed greentrification. There's now been a few studies put out about this. The one I reference here is from Spelman College in Atlanta. And the study found that green infrastructure projects, including farms, as well as other parks, was actually leading to an increased acceleration of gentrification in neighborhoods. And the study does at the end propose a few suggestions for ways to add green infrastructure, including farms, without necessarily accelerating the gentrification process. And so we expect there will be more work done on this in the next few years, and we'll have maybe a toolkit that could be used of solutions here. But it's very important especially if we're adding infill agricultural systems into existing neighborhoods, that it is not displacing people at a faster rate. And then community engagement is a very important part of this integrated planning process. We need to bring all the stakeholders in, but certainly if we're creating a food production system that is to serve its immediate community needs to have a lot of buy-in to the plan. I actually got to go to the grand opening of the Browns Mill Food Forest in Atlanta, and the community engagement process there, at least from the outside, appeared to be very strong. And it was even a local resident who was the primary employee taking care of the food forest, the only employee, I believe, of the food forest itself. And so that sort of engagement's really important, not only to make sure that you have engagement down the road, but the process for that is ensuring that the park or the amenity or the green infrastructure that you're putting in is actually something people want. And that's what'll get that engagement from them. Then it's appropriate also that we're appropriately considering land uses. And so considering what the biome or bioregion may have been or may currently be in our more extreme urban environments, the biome now is basically urban. And it's a new biome that we've created. In some areas, it may be that you're still on the fringes of the city and there still is open land with an existing biome. And it's important that we are thinking about what that biome is as we determine what sort of production system we're going to have. So if you were in the redwood forests, you're going to have very fungal soils that are deep, probably leaning acidic. And so you want to think about the system you create making sense for that existing soil and climate. You also have to consider adjacencies. Lulus are locally undesirable land uses. Some of those already exist and we need to think about them. And to some people, agriculture is a Lulu. And so it's really important that we are also educating on what these systems are going to be like and considering the neighbors of these parks and farms. And then scale is also very appropriate. We've seen all too often where people try to jump into much too large of a scale from the start, rather than starting maybe with a smaller production area, but with room to grow over time. But then on the alternative side of that coin, a quarter-acre community garden only serves so many people. And so making sure that if we are trying to serve a neighborhood, that the aggregate of all of the farms or community gardens within that space are enough to hopefully make a meaningful impact. Next slide, please. Also, it's really important to look not just at your costs right away when you're planning, but to look at a life cycle analysis of the cost of the place, both to make sure that the funding mechanisms are in place and the energy is in place to serve it long term, but also to look at the long-term benefits, which when we're working with regenerating these natural systems, so many of the benefits may take 2 to 5 years, maybe even 7 or 10 years to really show clearly. And so it's important that we're looking out at that long-term horizon. So we need to recognize the complexity of these ecosystems. Plan with humility. This is a phrase that we use a lot as we're planning agricultural amenities. It's really easy to think this is our 7th or 8th one. We understand what we're doing, put the rubber stamp here. And Mother Nature has reminded us how insignificant we are individually from time to time when we've done that. So planning with humility and preparing for any number of outcomes is really important. Back to the stakeholder conversation, having a diversity of views really helps reduce your risk. If it's all planners in the room, or if it's all farmers in the room, or if it's all local residents in the room, you probably don't have the diversity of views that you need. It's important to have all of those different groups represented. Have to consider the cost of operation, not just the cost of installation. This is where a lot of programs go wrong. The city may find a way to fund a farm in the short term and install it into a park, but the cost of its operation long term, or even just the cost of maintaining the site around the actual farm, may be left out of that. And it's really important that those are considered. And then I already talked about the long-term benefits. So measurement is key. I want to say here, it's very easy to say, okay, well, we understand that farms can provide ecosystem benefits and they're significant. And so we're just going to assume that all farms are providing great ecosystem benefits. And that is not necessarily the case. Every farm is different. And so as John Kemp at Advancing Eco-Agriculture says, you can only manage what you measure. And so we think that it's really key to measure. So on the next slide here, we talk a little bit about some of those measurements. From a resiliency and ecosystem services standpoint, we can look at percolation, which is how quickly water enters the ground. There's very easy, build it on your farm systems that you can create to measure this. There's also $1,000 meters that you can borrow from ATRA or NCAT or other sustainable agriculture organizations. We can look at some analogs of carbon sequestration. We can look at the organic material in the soil and make some side calculations to get to that. And in fact, there are some farms that have proven gains in putting carbon into the soil that were for a very long time by soil scientists not believed to be possible. But by following certain soil management practices, you can actually increase the organic material in your soil quite a bit and much quicker than we thought. We can do wildlife assays, measure the number of birds, earthworms, other animals, and insects moving through your space. Moving to the health and human benefits, we can talk about the pounds of food that the farm creates, and that's a number you see a lot, is how much food did we create. Food waste is also a big problem, so I think it's important to look at the pounds of food that actually made it into people's hands compared to the pounds of food that you've created. And then even further to look at how has a local source of vegetables or fruit or whatever you're growing affected the diet choices of the community. And so are you now seeing more vegetables consumed as a whole, even if they're bought at the grocery store and not just from the local farm? Further, economically, we have local job creation and training, developing skills, and being an employer within the community that can be really important. And so I just want to make the note that one way we measure Harvest Green is a master planned community in Southwest Houston, and that's our oldest farm that we have there. We're going on 6 years now. These numbers are from a year and a half ago, but there's a soil health test called the Haney soil health test that was developed by a soil scientist, Rick Haney, here in Texas. And we saw in a 3-year time frame an improvement from a 6 to 11, with 30 being a magnificent soil. And so, you really can see the results on these if you're measuring. But sometimes we don't see results, and then we change our practices. And so the last thing I'll say is that, we're starting to see more farming as a service across the country. And so rather than let's just provide an opportunity for a local farmer, it may be let's provide opportunities for organizations that hire local farmers, that develop local farmers, that provide more resources for local farmers. And we see the farming as a service model aligning incentives for municipalities a little bit better even than the straight for-profit models. Although for-profit farming is very important and needs to be supported, and we need to make sure that our not-for-profit farming isn't disturbing the marketplace for our for-profit farmers. But it can do a better job of accounting for all of the externalities that exist with agriculture, and many of those are positive externalities for agriculture. It can help develop place-based expertise and provide more stability for these projects as well. And so I think we're finishing here on the next slide with a quote. I've broken one of the many cardinal rules of presentations and given you a paragraph to read. And so hopefully these will be made available afterwards, and you all can read it on your own. But this is a quote from Chris Newman, who's a farmer in the Chesapeake Bay area, and certainly a thought leader in looking back to indigenous foodways and how they can be applied in today's world on a for-profit, meaningful economic scale that feeds meaningful numbers of people. And so here in his quote, he talks about some of the ways that he could see food production being woven into the landscape, and not just thought of as agriculture being a completely separate operation located only in places with other agricultural operations.
Thank you, Scott. Jeffrey, we'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. And Michael, if you can just give me a time check. I know there was a question in the chat, so I want to make sure we give time for that.
Sure. We've got another 24 minutes.
All right, perfect. So
plus a few because we started late.
All right. So, really what I want to discuss on these next slides is this idea of, smart cities and how to cultivate, resilient communities in terms of urban agriculture as we go through this conversation. And I think what's really important is to understand a little bit about how we got here. The industrialization of agriculture has essentially regulated agriculture to the rural countryside, to peri-urban areas. And as cities have become these powerhouses for economic development and attractive places to live, we have really removed this idea and this practice of farming from our communities and from our culture. And this generational disconnect that we are now experiencing has really, presented a lot of issues among training, among the future production of food, and the role that cities can play in food production. And I think what's important to see and to ask is, how can a city really be smart if it doesn't account for agriculture or food production within its city limits? And I think as we look at these new technologies that cities are now incorporating into their systems, whether it's renewable energies, solar panels, the Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, it's interesting to note that urban agriculture is one of these great technologies that really embodies the nexus of food, water, energy, and waste, and how critical it is to really incorporate that into city planning, city initiatives, and strategies. So moving on to the next slide, one thing I kind of want to highlight is this trend of vertical farming. Now, vertical farming is not the end-all be-all. It's not going to fix all of the issues that we're facing. But one thing that we can pull from this is that there's a lot of investment and a lot of discussion around what these technologies can do for cities. And I think what's important to note here is that as there's continued investment into this specific sector of controlled environment agriculture, it opens up this conversation of what should the ecosystem of urban agriculture be in a city. Yes, vertical farms provide higher yield improvements, better water savings, require less land, but they also are energy intensive. And one of the challenges that we face in the industry as a whole is the lack of skilled labor that is currently available to operate and run these types of facilities, which also presents an opportunity in the form of career pathways and education. So following this trend, understanding that policymakers are getting behind this, and that even utility companies are providing incentives for these types of operations, we can better formulate what is the role that this one technology can play in a growing ecosystem that is urban agriculture. So in our next slide, really what we need to understand are what are the specific goals and scenarios that cities can implement as they start to incorporate agriculture into their planning process. It's not enough to say that we want more urban farms, more local produce. It has to be specific and connected to a problem. And looking at the ecosystem, this technology spectrum of high-tech CA operations to low-tech soil-based operations, we can start to formulate what are the specific types of urban agriculture that can be incentivized and implemented into cities as we move forward. So on this next slide and these next few slides, I'm going to kind of go through a very brief checklist of what cities can do as they start to plan for these different scenarios. And this relates to what we're doing with the city of Dallas in developing a comprehensive urban ag plan. And really the first thing we need to do is survey the local environment. What are the gaps? What are the challenges? What are those needs? And kind of echoing what Karen Washington was saying in the keynote earlier, what does the community want? If the goal is to produce more food locally to feed local communities, there are a variety of ways that can be implemented, whether it's a vertical farm, that may not be the best choice, whether it's a community garden, that might be a better choice. But it's important to understand what your community is asking for, what are the challenges that they're experiencing, and getting a better sense of what can a city do to better address those needs. Once we've done that survey, this could be anything from looking at available land to the existing growers and farms that already are operating in the space. We can then define key targets and metrics to focus on to help improve those areas of need. So with the city of Dallas, they have the CCAP plan, which is a very ambitious goal to help really build a resilient community among a variety of different focus areas. Goal 7 is around food. And of that goal, there are about 14 different action items that are all built together to help provide fresh, affordable access to food for Dallas residents. And one specific goal that we're focused on is this target of increasing acreage of production by 2030, 2040, and 2050. So being specific in what you're trying to achieve will help you better formulate the plan and action steps to get to achieving that target. And then the next slide, we talk about commitments. So developing a specific policy that your city officials, your policymakers are publicly committing to is essential. Make sure that they commit publicly and that they're creating specific budgets for urban ag. What Michael was saying earlier, in New York City, the city council just voted on a climate resiliency plan just last month that requires the New York City mayor's office to establish an Office of Urban Agriculture. And that will be placed within the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And this really will empower the city and the community to provide more of a coordinated effort on how to improve access to local produce, to improve the environmental benefits that community gardens can play in stormwater mitigation. It can help with urban heat island effect. It also requires them to establish a 13-member urban ag advisory board that's built from the community itself. So ensuring that you are having community input from anywhere from nonprofits to for-profit businesses to community gardens to vertical farms, greenhouses, really incorporating this entire ecosystem into the planning process. And then one thing that's important to note, as we move from commitment to creating, a lot of young entrepreneurs, students, and advocates might need a little help as they start pursuing this pathway of developing new urban agriculture farms or businesses. And one great way to do this is through incubator programs or accelerators, really providing a space where people can come together to discuss ideas, maybe provide grants and incentives, competitive or very favorable leases that give individuals a starting point to really expand upon their ideas. One thing that we did with agritecture is that we helped create a sister company called AgTechX, which was a very easy co-working space to join where people could come together through co-working, through meetings, through events to share their knowledge, share the challenges that they're facing, and have this open dialogue about what can I do or what can you do to better improve the challenges that you're trying to face. Going to the next slide. So really what's also critical, and this has been a very big topic of the conference so far that I've seen, is that we want to make sure that we're including the right type of communities and all the communities that are representative of your area. We want to make sure that we have people of color, women, youth, indigenous communities that are at the table providing their input and what they want for their community, because it is their community that they are building, and we are just here to help aid and foster that development. So this engagement of diverse communities is critical to developing the right policy that will provide long-term sustainable benefits to the community. And then following that, we have to track what we're doing. So it's not enough just to commit to certain policy initiatives, to publicly state that we're going to be making or building new urban farms, but we have to show the data that is representative of what we're trying to do, whether that's 1-year check-ins, 3-year check-ins, or 5-year check-ins. If we're not tracking it and we're not measuring it, then how do we know if we're going to achieve those targets? One city that's doing a great job at this is the city of Atlanta, with their urban ag director, Jeolu Bayuwe, who has just put out the latest Fresh Food Access report, which I think is their second or third report now since the development of his position back in about 2016 under the Kasim administration. This is a great example of what a city is doing, not just publicly stating the goals and targets that they're trying to achieve, but tracking it every few years through surveys, through community engagement, and really sharing that data with the wider public is critical in understanding what is working and what's not working. Next slide, please. So another component about this is understanding that urban agriculture, as impactful and powerful as it can be, it may not feed an entire city in and of itself. And this is where we can bring in a larger ecosystem of urban and rural partnerships, understanding that urban environments are very unique in that they can provide meeting places. They have a lot of talent, a lot of young people that are very fascinated, interested in the use of technology, might be wanting to get into ag tech, but might not want to be living in the rural countryside. We can foster those communities and then also bring in the regional and rural partnerships that allow for better uses of agriculture, whether it might be row cropping or require larger spaces, to help build a stronger ecosystem. So this combination of urban and regional is critical in developing a sustainable long-term plan that is beneficial to the entire community, not just the city, but those surrounding the cities, and creating this regional impact that is beneficial to all involved. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but this encouragement of entrepreneurship within food incubators is a critical piece. Bringing people together, really trying to share lessons learned, best practices, and new technologies allows for innovative solutions and ideas to come together that may not be discussed, when we're in our different silos. And having spaces like this in cities can really foster this engagement. It can really be a launch point for new startups, for new farms, and for new technologies that are really critical to combating climate change and the other problems that we collectively face as our planet is changing. And then highlighting a few of these examples in the next slide. These are a few of the cities that are kind of leading this change that we can pull, really good lessons from as we try to better understand what can work in our own cities. So in Singapore, the Singapore government is really being active in investment in creating new educational and training programs that are incentivizing new developments of urban agricultural operations, whether they're greenhouses, vertical farms, soil-based operations, but it is the commitment and the push by the government that is really facilitating this drive to allow Singapore, which is this island nation state that imports about 90% of their food, to move away from that model and really be self-sufficient in feeding its own people. In our next slide, we have Atlanta, which I've touched on. This is such an amazing city, not only because I lived there for 5 years, but we were able to produce the Atlanta conference, which really was this hub, this meeting place for people, not just in the city, but nationally and internationally, to come together to see what's happening in the city, but to also discuss what challenges that they're facing and what opportunities are presented when we tour different cities and see what different cities are doing. So we've done this for 3 years now. We did tours, we did workshops, we did facilitation of different community groups. And this was really critical in Atlanta, trying to understand what is the ecosystem in its city, who are the different players that might not be interacting with each other, and what can be done to bring everyone together to better understand how we can work collectively as a team. And then in our next slide, we look at the Permaculture program. And this was a really interesting competition that the city of Paris put out, incentivizing and bringing in different real estate developers to offer leases to rooftop farms where entrepreneurs could come together and build new green spaces for food production in their cities. Programs like these that are creative and ambitious can really spur a lot of innovative projects, can create new businesses, and can really encourage and provide confidence to people that want to get into farming in urban environments to do so when they know that the support is there from their city government. So a lot here. I definitely want to open the floor up to questions, and really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. And I do know there was a question in there for you, Haley.
Let's see. I don't, can someone read it? I don't
have
know.
it, Haley. I have it. The question is, what is the general timing expectation in years or seasons to move through the recession from pioneer to mature forest?
So that is actually a really difficult question to answer because it's really going to depend on the state of the soil and your climate as well. And something I've seen with permaculture is the dedicated maintenance can be a huge variable in how your food forest develops. If you have someone who just loves this food forest and goes out every day, maintains it, exercises all of these permaculture approaches, you can move through succession quite quickly. But if maybe you have a larger food forest, or maybe somebody doesn't utilize as many permaculture approaches, it can take a little bit longer, particularly if your soil has a lot of qualities that you need to overcome. If you got rock hard, really alkaline soil, some of those productive species are going to take a little bit longer to get established, and you're going to need to spend a little bit more time on that front end establishing your nitrogen fixers and nutrient accumulators, just to help that soil kind of regenerate and make it able to support more productive species later on.
Great, thank you, Haley. Jeffrey, I have kind of a question or comment that I'd like for your input on and some of your commentary, I guess specifically related to probably Atlanta and New York City. I mentioned earlier, I'm coming in as definitely not the agriculture expert. I'm very much focused on green infrastructure, water quality, flood mitigation, and things like that. And what I've noticed from city to city, starting in Detroit, where there are all these initiatives. What can we do with lots, abandoned lots, and underutilized properties? And there was a contingent that really directed it towards urban agriculture. Then there's the engineering contingent that directed it towards flood mitigation. And we see this happening over and over. And the larger the city, the more silos we have. Has Atlanta or New York City done something specific to really start addressing and bringing those silos together to look at expanding all the co-benefits of working together for common goals?
Yeah, I think what is very interesting, Atlanta was the first city in the US to create this position of director of urban agriculture. And through that, they created a dedicated website that showcased all the policies, all the initiatives and programs that they are offering to the city. And I think what's so impactful about that is that because the city said, hey, this is now a position within our city government, this is what we are taking seriously, and this is the go-to person that you can contact when you have an issue, a question, or maybe a solution or a suggestion, that has been very, I think, beneficial in furthering and fostering this ecosystem. New York City as well, we developed the NYC Ag Collective, which was a group of companies in New York City that were working to help lobby New York City government to, take urban agriculture more seriously. And I think what is also interesting to note about the NYC Ag Collective and just New York City in general, this conversation we had, is that we realized that through investment in technologies and ag tech, there was this feeling of resentment from the community gardeners and from people that have been in the space for so long that felt like they had just been left behind. And really, to have a beneficial ecosystem, all these different stakeholders need to be talking together, and we all need to understand, what are the challenges that we're facing specific to our own operations, and what can the city do in providing support for different types of operators, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're community gardens, or whether they're for-profit businesses. So I think going back to your question, having a dedicated office or person and having a public-facing website, I think speaks miles as to what a city is taking seriously and what and how residents or constituents respond to that.
Excellent. So we have 2 more questions and 3 more minutes. So we'll see if we can get through these in 3 minutes. The first one to you, Jeffrey, is which steps out of the 6 or 8 key phases you discussed tend to be the most skipped or brushed over by municipalities that you've worked with?
Yeah. Let me just pull it up real quick so I can refresh myself. I would say number one might be probably the biggest, because there's a lot of investment coming into ag tech. City officials kind of respond to that and be like, okay, here's all this money. How can we incentivize more of these operations? But in reality, these high tech operators are still producing a product that is sold at a premium, and that might not be affordable to all residents or all communities of a certain city. So it's important that when you're surveying different gaps in your market, you're understanding, you're first incorporating the needs of all your communities, and then developing certain targets to help achieve that. So I would say, having open dialogue and making sure that you're bringing the right people to the table that are reflective of your community.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeffrey. And one last question. We've got 2 minutes. Hi, Jody. Good to see you here, from Jody Lane in Austin. She says, our 501c3, which is Fruitful Commons, is looking to provide certifications, workforce solutions, et cetera, around community-led agriculture. What green jobs are you excited about to grow food, strengthen communities, and foster stewardship?
I could start off on this one. First I would say, coming from Houston, I'm just excited to see the idea of green jobs being offered at all. And I think it can be the same for Dallas. Austin certainly has been a little further ahead in that realm. But I love to see that those jobs are now starting to push towards agriculture, and what that means for small diversified operations in agriculture is that we're starting to see jobs that can actually pay a living wage, that aren't just someone taking the privilege that they have to not have to make an income and go out and run a farm that probably doesn't actually make any money but provides the lifestyle they want, which has been very common in our industry. And now we're starting to see, at least on the nonprofit and the slightly subsidized side, farm jobs where people can make a living and stay in them for a long period of time and still do work that's meaningful for them and their community.
Yeah, and I'll add just to that, from the green infrastructure world, there's been some initiatives from Washington, D.C., in Louisiana, the Green Corps of Louisiana, where they're really focused on environmental benefits of green infrastructure. Those things are great opportunities to start expanding into agriculture as well when we're trying to bring those silos together. And I think they create tremendous opportunities to grow professionally, create certifications, et cetera. So working together on these initiatives is very powerful.
I would like.
Oh, go ahead, Haley.
I'll go quickly, and hopefully we can get to Jeffrey here pretty soon. Selfishly, I would love to see more landscape architects. I am a landscape architect, and we do a lot to develop communities. And so on that front, I would love to see more landscape architects, specifically a diversified range. Right now, in the industry, we're really looking to hire a lot more people of color. We just need more diversity across the board. So I would love to see a greater influx of people for landscape architecture to help our communities grow and develop, and that's somewhat green. And within, again, kind of bias here, I would love to see more permaculture. Permaculture design courses are flourishing right now, and I would love to see more people find their way into that. It's kind of an alternate route to urban ag as we know it, and I would love to see that come on and take on a little bit more of a voice in the agricultural world, because I do think it has a lot to offer. So I think permaculture design and landscape architecture would be my options. Jeffrey?
I may have cut out there for that part of the question. Do you mind just restating it, Michael?
It was a question about workforce solutions, et cetera, around community-led agriculture. What green jobs are you excited about to grow food, strengthen communities, and foster stewardship?
Oh, yeah. What green jobs? I think it's just more farmers. That is a tough, admirable, and lifestyle that we need to encourage more in our cities. And I think there's some great initiatives that are being developed through Cornell University on workforce development to provide easier pathways for those that are interested in joining, the agricultural workforce to do so in urban environments. So whether it's through urban agriculture, controlled environment agriculture, I personally would love to see more young people get into farming and that be a sustainable career path in our cities. So I hope that answers the question as best. That's what I would love to see, especially given that the average age of a U.S. farmer is about 58 and getting older. I think the training that we need to help build the next generation of farmers and incorporating technologies that can be impactful to these businesses to make them not just sustainable but profitable, because they are a business, is what I'm most excited about.
Yep. Well, we're at 12:48. I know everyone needs to start going back to the main stage. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're real excited to be here and looking forward to the rest of the day. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.